Good morning. I'm John Lowry. I am a professor and department chair of the Student Affairs and Higher Education program at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. And it's my honor to welcome you to today's panel, The Student Personnel Point of View, 80 years later, Where Are We Now? If you have not recently read The Student Personnel Point of View of 1937, the 1949 Student Personnel Point of View.
Ask for a show of hands.
How many of you read it in grad school? How many of you read it in the last 2 years?
We have the grad students.
Mainly the people in grad school.
And the ones who talk.
One of the things that we've done, if you go to the website there, I've collected to make available the 3 statements, and you can also find links to each of the panelists' faculty web pages. But to begin, I'd like to invite each of the panelists to introduce themselves in whatever order they wish to do that. You can go, George. Everyone else is waiting for you.
This is Age Before Beauty. Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm George Koo. I'm presently a senior scholar at something called NALOA. How many of you have heard of NALOA? About as many people who've read the Student Personnel Point of View recently. That's the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment. It's based at the University of Illinois and also co-located at Indiana University. I was for 34 years on the faculty at the other Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. I was a department head and program head and associate dean a couple of times. One of what's called a baby dean, you know. Thank you. And I've had involvement in, a number of different projects. Some of you have heard of NESI, and maybe some of you know something about HIPS, high impact practices, and have had a hand in participating on writing teams in the past, including the 87 perspective and something called the Student Learning Imperative. How many of you, that's now a historical document, I guess, and okay. Pass.
Good morning. My name is Laura Sponsler. I'm a clinical assistant professor at the University at Denver. Good morning. It's early. I'm still drinking my tea. My research interests really focus on the civic development of college students and trying to understand the ways in which our colleges and universities prepare students for citizenship.
Good morning. My name is Natasha Kroom. I'm Assistant Professor of Higher Education and Student Affairs at Clemson University. My research agenda focuses on access and equity for women of color, particularly looking at faculty advancement beyond tenure, and so the role of full professors and governance of institutions, as well as undergraduate women of color and their engagement on college campuses.
Hi everyone, I'm Tracy Puentambasia. I'm a faculty member of clinical practice at the University of Southern California. I work a lot with master's and doctoral students. My research interests are very broad. Most recently, I've been very interested in issues related to globalization of higher education and international student access and success.
Thank you all very much. Let me give you a sense of what to expect. I'm going to begin by talking just a little bit about these 3 documents for those of you who perhaps haven't read them quite as recently. Then we'll move into the bulk of our program will be an opportunity for our panelists to respond to questions. I have some questions that I have prepared for them, but I'm going to invite you to ask questions as well. We're going to try to do that 2 different ways. If at any time you have a question, you can tweet it to the hashtag SPPV at 80, and I'll be trying to monitor that. And there will also be an opportunity at the end for anyone who wants to ask the question. And we'll ask you to use the microphones because they're recording today's session. I teach the history of higher education and student affairs. And I often tell my students that history is the story of people, and we at times lose sight of the people. One of the people that we've lost sight of is a gentleman by the name of Walter Dill Scott, who in many ways is the father, or certainly one of the fathers of the student personnel movement. Walter Dill Scott had gone to Germany and studied in the very early days of psychology, began teaching at Northwestern at the turn of the century, and in World War I took a leave from Northwestern and led an effort to use scientific methods to select officers for the Army. As a result of that and his work in psychology, in 1919 he becomes president of the American Psychological Association, and the next year, the president of Northwestern in 1920. And there he appointed a friend of his, a colleague by the name of L.B. Hopkins, to be director of personnel, which today sounds like a human resources job. But that was not what L.B. Hopkins did. His job was to encourage the systematic consideration of the individual. And the individual here meant the individual student, for the sake of both the individual and the institution. So Scott, as president, is also probably the person responsible for the field we know today as industrial psychology. He is not just a figure who played a significant role in our field, but in many ways, much more so in that field. So L.B. Hopkins comes and creates this personnel office. He would stay at Northwestern until 1925. In 1925, he himself becomes the president of Wabash College. Now, the influences of those two individuals don't end there, because during Walter Dill Scott and L.B. Hopkins' time at Northwestern, there was a young undergraduate student by the name of Esther Lloyd Jones, who met both Walter Dill Scott and L.B. Hopkins. They encouraged her to go to Teachers College to pursue her master's degree in Teachers College program, and then she returned and worked with Hopkins at Northwestern before he leaves to go to Wabash. And her dissertation was a study of the personnel office at Northwestern University. And one of the things Hopkins does in 1924 to 1926, he does one of the first student personnel research studies. He travels to 14 different colleges and universities around the country to study how they were organizing student personnel work. And in 1926 publishes what comes to be known on behalf of the American Council of Education, simply the Hopkins Report, which is a forerunner to the student personnel point of view in 1937. And the student personnel point of view, people were already starting to talk about that concept before the document was released in 1937. A number of different authors had been writing about this idea of a student personnel point of view. Hal Cowley, who at this point is at Ohio State, writes in 1936, "The personnel point of view is a philosophy which puts an emphasis upon the individual student and his all-around development as a person, rather than upon his intellectual training alone, and which promotes the establishment within educational institutions of curricular programs, methods of instruction, and extra instructional media to achieve such an emphasis." If we can set aside for a moment the stilted language, that describes what we do today. In writing in 1936, and Esther Lloyd Jones also wrote about this idea of a student personnel point of view. And what happens in 1936 is Hal Cowley and Donfred H. Gardner. Donfred H. Gardner was the Dean of Men at the University of Akron, and in fact, from 1937 to 1939 was NASPA president. The two of them wrote to George Zook, who was the president of the American Council on Education, and said, "We need to get people together to talk about this burgeoning student personnel movement." And they were able to convince him that that was a worthwhile goal. Zook had previously been president of the University of Akron, so Gardner, who was a leading figure in the field, had the advantage of a direct connection to Zook. And in 1937, the American Council on Education convened a conference on student personnel work, and they invited a group of individuals to come to Washington, D.C. And their purpose was to explore fundamental problems related to the clarification of so-called personnel work and the intelligent use of available tools and the development of additional techniques and processes. Now, the group they brought to DC included student affairs professionals. Donford Gardner was there, president of NASPA, Teresa Amos, the dean of women at the University of Pittsburgh, who was the president of the National Association of Deans of Women, and Esther Lloyd Jones, who was ending her presidency. She was president of ACPA from 1935 to 1937, were all there. There were a number of faculty present who primarily were teaching at that point in the fields of psychology and educational psychology. There were representatives from the federal government, representatives from industry, the president of AT&T, representative of K-12 education, and a number of several individuals from the American Council on Education, George Zook, and Donald Shank, who also had a connection to Akron. He had been the assistant dean of men at Akron and was hired by Zook when he went to ACE to be his assistant. So they meet and offer in 1937, the same year, this philosophical statement that argues that considering the student as a whole, including not only intellectual capacity and achievement, but emotional makeup, physical condition, social relationships, vocational aptitudes, skills, moral and religious values, economic resources, and aesthetic appreciations were all important. And then, not long after that, World War II happens. And George Zook, who continues to lead the American Council on Education, and coming out of that, right after the Second World War, Zook is asked by President Truman to chair the Truman Commission on Higher Education. And he chairs that. They issue their report in 1947, calling for a variety of key recommendations that one might argue we continue to try to fulfill today. That we abolish barriers to higher education, barriers that were financial in nature, but also addressing segregation in the South, religious discrimination in various parts of the country, particularly in the Northeast, where Jewish students were still regularly discriminated against at many institutions of higher education, a plan to double enrollment in American higher education, a call that we hear yet again today for free public education through grade 14. That's really the first time you hear the idea of free community college introduced, is in the Truman Commission's report. They wanted to create something we do now have, various forms of federal financial support for students to attend other than veterans, because at that point the only existing federal system was the GI Bill, and to provide federal money to support the growth, particularly of public higher education. As a result, it was concluded that so much had happened in the past 12 years that it was necessary to update the report. So they had another meeting in 1948. The Committee on Student Personnel Work met. The meeting was chaired by E.G. Williamson. There were 3 participants from the first student personnel point of view meeting present, Hal Cowley, Esther Lloyd Jones, and Donald J. Shank. So they meet in 1948, and the next year in 1949 issue their report that is the second student personnel point of view. One of the things I think we miss in looking at this history, or it's easy to ignore, and George reminded me of this point, in this period, from 1937 until the mid-1950s, the American Council on Education was actively involved in bringing together what we now know as student affairs professionals to talk about our work, and they were publishing a series of resources. In the 1940s and 50s, the American Council on Education had a student personnel monograph series that wound down in the late 1950s, and now we don't really think of them as being actively involved in the work that we do, but in this period, about a 20-year period from the mid-1930s to the mid-1950s, they were very actively involved. Then The next part of our story begins in January of 1986, when Judith Chambers, as president of NASPA, asked the board to approve a blue ribbon task force to look at the future of student affairs and to re-examine the student personnel point of view and prepare a statement that set forth the essential assumptions and purposes that underlie our work. George mentioned he was a participant in that document. A number of the other participants, if you know anything about NASPA's history, will be names that you immediately recognize. Peggy Barr, Jim Lyons of Stanford, Jim Radigan of Wichita State, Art Sandine of the University of Florida. The other panelists were Robert Albright, who was the president of Johnson C. Smith in Charlotte, and Ann Golseth, who was the president of Olheim College in California. Now, I have talked enough about that history. You were really here to hear from the esteemed panelists. I have a first question that's really for everyone, and that is, as we look particularly at the student personnel point of view of 1937, is this just a historical artifact to unearth and look at in history classes, or does it remain relevant and meaningful to our work today?
I can kick us off. I had some thoughts about that. I think when I revisited the document recently in preparation and pulling together my thoughts, one of the things I had to ask is this question of what it means to have a point of view. And I think for a person like myself who's worked as a practitioner and now as a faculty member, deeply immersed in the field, and we read lots of documents that guide our work. So I was glad to hear John talk about the student personnel point of view as a philosophy, because that's what comes through most strongly. But then I have to ask the question, I know this is an older document, but today we would ask, is this grounded in research? Like, where does this come from? Is this something that's standards-based, like CAS, right? How does one use a document that has a point of view? Or do we take it simply as a philosophical statement moving forward? And I'll just add a couple of other thoughts related to this concept of relevance, or this question of relevance. I started thinking back to the kinds of things that would connect 2017 to 1937. And I was pretty hard-pressed to find much of anything that has relevance. When I look at 1937, the first class stamp cost 3 cents, and we are well past that. It was the year that Amelia Earhart's plane disappeared over the Pacific Ocean. The Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco was finished that year. Color TVs would not hit the market for 20 years, microwave ovens 30 years, and it was 18 years before Steve Jobs was even born. So, the devices that we know and love today and we count on were definitely nowhere in the realm. But yet we asked this question about the relevance of this framing document that was created in 1937. And I think in many ways, and I don't want to take up all the time, but I think in many ways, this framing document and subsequent ones remain relevant in sort of discussing the foundational and philosophical approaches that still shape our work. There are a number of caveats to that, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And the other perspective I have is in any document like this that is wide in scope, that's a collaborative product, the individuals, the authors, could not possibly have imagined the conditions, right, that we face today. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but that there are significant changes to not only the student demographic, but also the structure and the work of universities, both on campus and off campus. And then in that way, one has to question whether some of those conditions or changes could have been foreseen, and then ways in which a redo, a 2017 version, might look very different. So I'll just start with that.
I think, so the question is of relevance, and I definitely think that the 1937 is relevant today. And I know, like many of my colleagues here, having used this document to teach in the master's prep program, it becomes questions of what are sort of the underlying narratives that are being told in here, and how can we use this document to not only understand, well, to understand what was happening then and how these narratives that are embedded within have shaped our field and our profession. And so, one of the things that we talk about is the ways in which the field is built upon patriarchy. And so if we think about the ways in which gender is looked at, and that's probably a more obvious one from the 1937 document, where all of the gender pronouns are masculine in nature, but really connecting that, right, not just from an individual or group level thinking, but really to a systemic level thinking, right, because that matters also. And thinking about the ways in which other systemic ideas are not talked about or are talked about, like race and ethnicity, and really trying to unpack those narratives and what they mean. And some of that is not there at all, right? 1937. But then, thinking about who's writing these documents, and what, you ask this, or, present this great question about, like, what does it mean to have a point of view? And so really asking that question, whose point of view is this? And really being able to understand how that point of view has shaped our field and actually continues to permeate the rest of the documents. The language shifts a little bit, but really you can still see elements of some of these systems across the other documents as well, and we'll probably unpack that a little later.
One of the things that stuck out to me as I reread these documents, probably for the fourth time this year after teaching this, was this idea that the student personnel perspective encompasses the view of the whole student, and how the whole student is defined here is physically, socially, emotionally, spiritually, as well as the intellectual development of our students. And I think the way that it's presented historically informs how we think about those areas or domains of student development today. The heteronormative kind of ways in which we thought about students in 1937 in some ways affect the ways in which our campuses continue to operate. And I think the diversity of opinion, the diversity of thought around those developments is something that we can continue to work on as scholars and practitioners to kind of broaden the perspectives to be beyond the narrow view that Natasha shared. And then the other thing that I think about when reading this document is who was it written for? Right? Was it written for practitioners or was it written for leaders? And I think that perspective also kind of shapes these documents, in that it doesn't give a lot of teeth or a lot of advice or a lot of guidance. And so I think our graduate prep programs and the work that we do in educating the students are really looking for how do we put these things into practice. And I think that's where this philosophical document can still inform our work and be used as a way to conversation, but to think beyond the way that things were done 80 years ago.
So now I have nothing to say. After that, John, I really appreciated your taking us through the ideology of these documents. It was very instructive for me. The question about, well, and as others have said in their own way, every report document is written during a certain time and with a certain point or points of view, and we have to acknowledge that. And John's point about, what happened between 37 and 49 that prompted. So that's why I had a colleague once who said, paper does not refuse ink. Remember when you used to actually write things down? And so we can expect spates of reports at given points in time, and I'll come back to that when we talk about the 87 document. But relevant for what is really the question, and is it a historical landmark document? Of course, 37. 49 as well. Relevant less for practice because of all the changes that you've just begun to hint at, but very relevant for why we do what we do. I don't think that changes from 37 to 2017. It's a very, very bold statement. And of course, it comes at a point in time when there was a vacuum. You had small groups of people writing and talking about the field, this emerging field, which, by the way, for those of you who remember the 1969 article in the Personnel and Guidance Journal, which was the main journal back in '69, James Penny wrote this article, Student Personnel Work, a Profession Stillborn. So even though you had these landmark documents, there were still people out there saying, what in the hell is this thing called student personnel, and why do we do it? So I think it remains relevant because the review of it and 49 and so on reminds us from where we've come. And when handled well, as these good people do in their classes, it also is a touchstone for how much further we need to go.
Thank you. Tracy, I want to come back to some of your original comments. How does this seminal document, as well as the 49 and the 87 document, connect to the focus that we have today on student success and persistence? In 1937, I think it's fair to say there was a much more Darwinian approach. If you fail, perhaps you weren't supposed to be here. That is not the perspective that we take today, but how do you see those connections?
One of the things that strikes me when we focus first on the 1937 document, because the subsequent documents really sort of build off of that, is it's a very structural approach, and I don't think it's a bad thing. I think foundational documents often offer definitions and processes, and when I look at the original documents and then the responses, it sort of keeps addressing those things. And when we look at those documents and we look at our campuses, we can see that those elements are in place, right? We see the kinds of offices. We talk about coordination. The documents talk about coordination and the relevance for collaboration, communication among organizations and offices and between students and offices. But again, sort of thinking about the early documents and more recent views, I think the complexity of those collaborations and coordinations, for example, have changed significantly. So the kind of stakeholder groups that were invested in student wellness, for example, would include a much longer list, right? So when we look at the earlier documents, and even in '87, there's mention of the changing student demographic and how some of these offices will look different. But I think there would be a much more complex view when we apply these early documents to our work today. That would include collaboration among parents and alumni to our campuses, and including even external stakeholders like accreditors and compliance officers. And I would say the other pieces, the earlier pieces versus the later pieces, that there is very little substantive evidence about why any of this matters. So going back to the original question about what is a point of view offered and how do we know these things are important? Why are these things important? And the 75th anniversary document really puts more focus on some more of a perspective that's more grounded in evidence. Another comment I have is this issue of accountability, which is very relevant to our work at Student Affairs. I love the fact that evaluating was a part of several of the priorities. But yet, especially when I talk to my grad students, they feel like assessment is in vogue right now, like it's a new thing. And clearly it is not a new thing. It was very well positioned. Assessment and also continuing research as a way of understanding and developing, refining our work was clearly a priority from the earlier days. The way that takes shape today and how that's more relevant than ever is not only just the accountability that our campuses face both internally and externally, but the implementation of things like college scorecards, right? So a lot of our campuses are being evaluated, rightfully so in many ways, in terms of issues related to access and equity and outcomes, graduation rates. The federal government is looking at things like gainful employment, focusing currently on for-profits, but really asking the question of how well do we prepare post-secondary institutions prepare their students for the working world, student right to know. All of these things raise the specter of what we do and how funds are spent at the institutional level. So again, this early conversation about the need to assess and to document and the ways in which we need to learn and improve, that definitely applies, and it's very relevant to our work, even if it's not something that we would have really focused on all the time. It's something that's very important. The last thing I will say is related to this issue of accountability is I think one of the struggles that we talk about is not necessarily all of our work with students is measurable, right? So as much as we like to say we could document that learning outcomes were met, there is definitely a latent developmental effect to our work. And I think one of the questions is really, the place and role of longitudinal research, but also understanding that our work is about investment in students and their long-term development. How do you measure the value and the worth of that? And that's not a question for 1937, it's a question through all time, really, is how do we make sure that we can document that? And I'll leave it at that for now.
Anyone else want to add any thoughts on this issue of student success and persistence? Well, Natasha, I want to come back to something that you said. If we think about 1937, in 1937, access to higher education for African Americans was largely limited to historically black colleges and universities, with only a few thousand African American students attending colleges and universities outside of the segregated South. In the 1930s, women did represent a sizable portion of college enrollments, more than 40%, but the lives of college women, or co-eds as they were commonly called at the time, were much more highly regulated than college men. What narratives are forefronted in background? That's the real point that you talked about in your earlier comments across these three documents.
What you said. No, I'm kidding. Which is what I said. So one of the things that I think is interesting is, as you brought up, that there is at least a one-liner that talks about access or limited access for black students in the documents. And what is interesting to me, so I think a lot about narratives, right, and how we understand narratives and how narratives actually shape our thinking and then shape our behavior and our practices in the field. And so one of the things, and race, racism is just one example of this that is illuminated in this document. So one of the things I think about, right, so we mention HBCUs in there, in the documents, right? And so we also mention black students in the document. Who don't we mention in the documents along racial lines? So we don't talk anything about, none of these documents talk anything about Latino, Latina, Latinx communities. Obviously, it wouldn't use the language of Latinx, but right, none of those communities. We don't talk about Asian communities. We don't talk about indigenous communities at all in these documents. And what's interesting to me is that while we understand HBCUs, the historic nature of those, Hispanic serving institutions were a thing when one of these documents was written, but we don't talk, that narrative is not there. And in fact, there's coded, I would describe it as coded language around Latinx communities. So it talks about English language learners. There's a line there and there that talks about English language learners, I think. And so what is that coded language for? Right, and I think we understand that. Typically we talk about that around Latino, Hispanic communities. And so, I just think it's so important for us to, and I know we've talked about what would a 2017 going forward document look like, and my hope would be that we really try to incorporate what I think are more points of views around what folks are experiencing and what our role should be in those lives. in folks' lives, right? There's talk about institutional diversity in the documents, but again, that in some ways is a little limited. You know, there is some history in these documents, but again, whose histories are we talking about? Whose histories are we claiming importance, right, across these three documents? Of course, there's not really the use of women in there. As you pointed out, co-eds is the language, right? There's like all, right? So how do we become a little bit more forthright about what communities we are working with, and the differences of experiences that they're having, the different ways that we're engaging with these different communities across institutional contexts, I think becomes really important if we look to continue doing this. And the last thing around this is, for me, is, you know, the documents are not, I don't think the documents are atheoretical. I think we just don't name the perspectives that are being used to construct them. And we see a little bit, we get, I think, a better understanding of the sort of theoretical and even maybe epistemological perspectives that are in the last document, right? And so there's talk around pluralism, but there's certainly, you know, opportunities for us to advance to talk and use language that around equity and justice in our field and the roles for those issues as well.
Anyone else want to chime in?
I just want to add, I think I was channeling Natasha as I was writing my notes. I think we were aligned. One of the notes that I wrote was, again, around if we were to write a 2017 version, we would be asked to consider counter-narratives or to decolonize our basic assumptions about how we approach higher education. So definitely it was something that I was thinking about as well.
Laura, as we move to 1949, one of the changes, one of the pieces that is emphasized in a much greater way is the issue of democracy. The authors of the 1949 statement identified 3 new goals for higher education, in addition to higher education's more classical purposes of the preservation, transmission, and enrichment of the important elements of culture through scholarship, research, imagination, and the human experience. And the 3 things they talked about as new goals were education for a fuller realization of democracy in every phase of living, education directly and explicitly for international understanding and cooperation, and education for the application of creative imagination and trained intelligence to the solution of social problems in the administration of public affairs. Can you talk a little bit about how that perspective carries through to our emphasis today on citizenship and civic engagement?
Absolutely. I think it'd be worth kind of tracing the thread of how democracy and citizenship is mentioned in the documents. And so in 1937, the only mention of any kind of common good or public purpose or beyond the individual himself is in one tiny line in a section about the after-college adjustment for men, right? And so the idea is that the men will become educated for a common good once they leave our campuses, right? So there's no integration of that public purpose or that public mission in 1937. And if you think historically about what was happening at that time, as George mentioned, these documents are of a time and place. That was during isolationism with a distinct focus on the individual. And that document reflects that perspective. Not explicitly, but when you're looking for this thread of democracy, you see that idea of isolationism in the ideas of the pursuit for the individual good. But what happens, as we know, in the late 30s and early 40s is World War II turns all of those notions upside down, right? And so you see that within the first 4 sentences are those 3 goals that explicitly tie to democracy, intentional and international understanding and cooperation, which we can start to see the beginning threads of internationalization and globalization. And then 3, the application of creative imagination, I love that phrase, right? And intelligence to solve social problems, which is why many of us in this room, I think, are doing the work that we do, that we're hoping we educate our students to be creative problem solvers, to solve the messy problems of our world. And they begin to tie this to others. And so you see the individual development as tied to the ability to work with others, which I think is a common theme in the work that we do. Now, they don't use the language that we use today. They don't use civic learning and democratic engagement, right? But you start to see the ties of cultural understanding to democracy. This ideas of weaving diversity and democracy together. Things that we take as commonplace on our institutions were really being stated. And if you think about who wrote the Truman Commission, where that was the whole purpose of that document was really promoting democracy. I think democracy is mentioned almost 47 times in that document. And you think about this document, you can see that the authors had a perspective, all right? That this is what our world needed. Not just our country, not just our individuals, but this is a goal for our world. And that theme is tied through the 1987 document, which acknowledges the context for which it was written. So they take you historically through the Civil War, World War II, the Cold War, and in today's political climate, they directly tie diversity to democracy. And these ideals are inextricably linked. On page 11, they say citizenship should be taught. So it goes beyond this thing that happens after college to some ideal that we should do to this is a part of our practice. And as a practitioner, this makes me infinitely happy. But I also think it ties to our purposes of the student development beyond the self, and that how do our institutions prepare our students to have civic skills, knowledge, and abilities to work at those social problems creatively and with their intelligence. And so in 2017, I think about the work that the student affairs field has done, and in the past 5 years, NASPA established the LEAD initiative, which I was privileged to found and run. This year they founded a new knowledge community focused on civic learning and democratic engagement. You see the ties of NASPAs to other organizations working around diversity and democracy. And so if 2017 was going to talk about this, we'd be writing from our time and place. We'd be writing about bringing people together. We'd be writing about the political divide. We'd be writing about the technological divide. And we'd be writing about how can we bring our students together to connect diversity and democracy beyond, I think, just nomenclature. But what are the practices in which institutions can institutionalize civic engagement and really fulfill that public purpose of educating students who then can create the democracy for a diverse world that our country needs.
Anybody else need a moment to chime in? Well, let's jump forward again, George. You were part of the group that wrote the 1987 perspective on student affairs. As you look back at Judith Chambers' charge to the committee and the work that the committee did, why was it so important? I think we've heard hints about this already, but why was it so important to update those earlier perspectives at that time?
I think we've already heard why. What hasn't been mentioned is just a few years preceding 1987, there was this 1983 document, A Nation at Risk. This was a national document proclaiming that the state of education, PK 20, was nowhere near, the quality of education was nowhere near it should be. And the sky was falling. Now, some of you weren't born yet, but I'm telling you, the sky was falling. And a year later, the post-secondary education community wrote Involvement in Learning. And it had 3 planks in it, the first 2 of which I can't remember, but the third was assessment, and how important assessment was to guarantee that the public was getting its money's worth out of post-secondary education. So there was a fair amount of foment in the land at that time. This is not really reflected so much in the 87 perspective, but it was a time for anniversaries, John. It was the 50th year, which is, I think, what NASPA and Judy Chambers were focused on. It wasn't so much that the 37 and 49 documents were no longer relevant in terms of what they hoped for and why we do what we do. It was 50 years, so let's do something. Let's celebrate and let's look forward. Now, the document is titled A perspective on student affairs. The writing group was very, very sensitive to the notion that it could not possibly speak for everybody in the field. And if you go through the document, I'm sure you're going to run back, if you haven't already called it up on your handheld, you'll see that the subheadings then, as you move through the document, it's consistent. It says points, plural, points of view. This is not to say that there wasn't some sort of dominant narrative of you. If you look for it, you will surely find it. But I just want to reiterate again that the group was very keen on making certain that there will surely be other points of view or other interpretations that would be valid and hold sway. The other thing that I think the document did reasonably well, and if we were to go through the long list, for example, there are something like 16 statements about what the field, what student affairs should be expected to do for its institution. And there are another dozen more, 13 I think, what student affairs should be expected to do with and for students. I'm not going to read them all, but there are some that are very, very relevant, I think, to they don't go into nearly as much detail, and that's another issue with these documents. How much and what kind of language can you use? The 87 perspective was intended not just for the student affairs field. Very clear in the opening that we wanted others on campus to understand what student affairs should be expected to do. We wanted people outside now, I'm not sure very many people outside the institution ever read it. I'm not sure most of the field read it, which is true of all these kinds of statements. Sometimes they're better left as historical documents giving people guideposts. But there's a long list of expectations, and I think if we were to read through them today, you'd say, yeah, that's about right, but I might change this phrase. Or surely we've got to add a couple of things about issues related to certain student characteristics that were in fact either intentionally hidden or were practically invisible to us at these moments in time that are no longer, fortunately, invisible to us. The last thing, the invitation to think back on the interactions with these people, and it wasn't just these 7 people locked in a room. If you read through the document, you'll see that we had a dozen different presentations around the country over this year period, 16 meetings and so on. I wish, and of course, anytime you have a camera, and you're recording, it may inhibit what people say, but I just wish these meetings would have been recorded, because they were not simply, 7 people nodding affirmatively to whatever else was being said in the room, but it was a deep kind of pondering of what it is we do, why we do it, why we couldn't say this, and why we should try to be stronger here. And with a great deal, I think, of how can I say this? I'm not drawing up the right word. These were people who knew that they didn't have all the answers, but they sure were willing to prod others to try to help them better understand the field and where it might be going. The last thing I'll say, maybe it probably won't be the last thing I'll say, but as was mentioned, John mentioned Margaret, as we know her, Peggy Barr was on this writing team, and I know she has said it in multiple places at multiple times, but she kept reminding us, and I don't think it comes out, these words are not in the document. Student affairs is the conscience of the campus. It is this group of people who accept the obligation to remind everybody else, and hopefully including themselves, why we're here. It harkens back to the 37 point of view in terms of attempting, and which precedes the 37. Our task is to do what we can to personalize the experience of every student. Now, that's a grand aspiration, unattainable, unfortunately, but we should not back off from trying to attain it. Student affairs is the conscience of the campus, and when I read in yesterday's, Inside Higher Ed chronicled email delivery. President of the University of Virginia, remind me of her. Terry Sullivan, saying in this current context in terms of free speech and so forth, there is no acceptable high road and low road. We got to take the middle road. We got to make sure everybody's voice is heard and respected on campus. And I think if we could have said something like that in the document, if we would have been that kind of forward thinking, we probably would have.
Well, I want to provide you the opportunity to ask questions. We have an assemblage of panelists who bring a variety of perspectives and areas of expertise to this issue. So I do want to give a chance for any of you to ask questions. There are microphones, which you need to use, I think, only so that they can record your question, or you can simply stand up and ask your question, and I'll do my best to repeat it for the purposes of the recording. And I'm also blinded by really bright lights, so I see someone walking out.
Hi, my name's Kyla Martin. I'm a first-year graduate student at Northeastern. This is a combination of a comment and question building off some of the things you said, but thinking about how these historical documents didn't include certain identity groups, and thinking about moving forward to 2017 where we are now and how you're talking about we need to include these. How are you sure, how do you balance the good work that, or these foundational things that we use today with also acknowledging that they weren't acknowledging these identities and maybe they weren't built for these identity groups in the work you do?
So my answer is going to tangentially relate to your question, and I acknowledge that ahead of time. But I think that's why we teach our students to be critical thinkers and critical consumers of material, right? And so I think all of us have stated in some way thinking about when was this written, who wrote it, what perspective were they writing from, who's in this document, who's out of this document, and why does that matter? And I think as professors, and so your question indicates that you're critically thinking about the purposes of these documents. And so I think it's easy to do that work on historical documents because we're removed from it. I think it's sometimes harder to do that in contemporary day. But we need to do that for everything we read. I think that civic literacy piece is something that's not mentioned in these documents, but is a core to what student affairs professionals do, and also is a core to the purpose of higher education is creating critical thinkers. And so your question is inherent to kind of thinking about, what are the purposes of these documents, and then what does that mean for today? And so I think absolutely, we didn't include every identity. I didn't write any of these. I was not old enough to. But the people that came before us that wrote these documents, didn't have the perspectives that we do today. And so I think our challenge as scholars and practitioners is to always be forward-thinking, to be reflective of our past, but to be forward-thinking about, what perspective do I have? What voice am I using? Who am I including? Who am I leaving out? And I think that is a task that we all can do in our programming, the way that we design our programs, and the way that we write as scholars, as the way we speak on panels. What perspectives are we bringing? And I think acknowledging our own epistemologies, acknowledging our own perspectives and identities helps in being a more inclusive and I think more realistic representation of what our field has to offer.
I just want to read you two statements from '87 and ask you how you would modify them to respond to, I think, the concern that you're raising or challenge that you're. So this is a statement about what institutions can expect of student affairs. Advocate and help create ethnically diverse and culturally rich environments for students. That's what that's the statement that student affairs should be doing for its institution. And for students, our obligation to students is to help students understand and appreciate racial, ethnic, gender, and other differences. How would you modify those statements to be more relevant to today?
So I probably wouldn't modify those statements. I think more along what my question is like people who created those and people who sat at the table to create those didn't look like me, and those spaces weren't created for me. And so thinking about the whole idea of can you dismantle the master's house with the master's tools, I wonder how do you balance that? That's something that I believe in now, that yes, we need to create these inclusive campuses and these inclusive spaces where people not only are represented, but they feel like they belong in those spaces. But like, how do you balance that? I don't disagree with what is being said, just like the concept of it all.
Thank you for your statements and your questions, right? I think part of so there was something said earlier that I think is really interesting, and I'm thinking again about the power of language. And so the words diversity, right? Like, let's appreciate diversity. What was the last statement you read around teaching students?
Help students understand and appreciate.
Help them to appreciate.
Well, understand
or-
precedes appreciate.
Okay, and help students to understand and appreciate, right? Like, I think today, what I think about is how do we acknowledge the tensions and the conflicts that are there, right? How do we openly do that? So like in our classrooms, maybe we're talking about that, right? Like maybe we're having these conversations that, you know, that post-secondary institutions weren't built for particular minoritized communities. And in fact, many of them were built on the backs and bones, right, and sweat of minoritized communities. How do we openly have that conversation at this level through these documents? Right, like I think, and that's why I think, you know, as some of us have said, is we look forward, and if another one of these documents is created, it's like part of the narrative that we have to tell is that. Because whether we want to admit it or not, that history has also informed our field. And even though, you know, I think, you know, we've teetered on this, like, is it a statement of philosophy? Does it inform our practice? Was it meant to inform our practice? Again, philosophy does inform your practice. Our thinking informs our practice. Our thinking informs how we structure things, right? And so how do we acknowledge the conflicting messages with the conflicting practices? How do we move beyond acknowledging, understanding, and helping students understand diversity? How do we move beyond diversity for democracy, right, to equity, right? How do we shift the action parts of this? I mean, advocating obviously is action-oriented, but if we start to really unpack what do we mean by helping people to critically think, how can we be more obvious about what that even means? Right, because I know for me as a woman of color entering a classroom, often talking about, do you even know what we're talking about when we say critical thinking? Do you know where it comes from? Do you know what it means? So when you ask me, why are you always talking about power and race and gender and white supremacist heteropatriarchy, then I can say, well, because, you know, that thing, it says critical thinking is built on critical social theory, and that's really what we're supposed to be talking about here. Like, that's what it's connected to. And so I really appreciate your question, because I think it's really about how can we attempt to create a more full picture of how our field has been shaped, right, and its connections and disconnects from people's experiences, right? And so some of it's not that some of the words aren't there, but it's that some of those words mean really particular things, right? Like if we, you know, diversity versus inclusion, right, versus equity versus equality, or maybe it's an and or, both and, all and, really, right? And so that's kind of how I think about your question.
Yeah, I think that the word help is interesting too. I struggle with that word because it applies such a power differential. So I help someone who can't do for themselves. And so I think student affairs educators, we want to help the students, right, help them. Just requires that we know and they don't know. And so I think that what knowledge do our students bring? What experiences do they bring? What identities do they bring? And how do we bring that out as opposed to, help? I don't know, just an interesting, so that's one of the things I would maybe change.
And thankfully, that language has been changed, right? Like and some other things around supporting versus helping, and that's great.
I just want to say thank you also for your question around this issue of identities and how those are reflected or not in the early documents. I also want to connect it to sort of my opening comments about the conditions and the changes in conditions which could not have been foreseen. And related to identities, I also think about the changes in, for instance, the rise of the for-profit industry, right, within higher education, distance and online learning. I mean, residentiality on services that are offered on campuses are big components of sort of the earlier concepts. And the question for many of us who work with online students, and it's a growing population really, is how does that language apply? How do we support and serve students we never see on our campuses? And that is a growing proportion of our enrollments. Non-traditional students, adult learners, first-generation college students. The complexity of these identities are also not reflected. And I also wonder if we were to create a 2017 document, would that list be reordered in any meaningful way? Would financial aid rise? Who could have predicted, well, maybe someone could have, but the rapid rise in cost of tuition, right? And the impact on families and students and loan debt. That may be a more salient issue with that rise. The shifting of financial aid dollars to merit scholarship versus need-based. All those complexities that we grapple with, that would affect, I think, potentially the perspective or even the ordering of the list. So,
Can I add one more thing really quickly? Sorry, just got my nerd juices flowing. Our job is to push. If our field is truly the conscience of the campus, then isn't our job to push? Like you use the quote, right? Like using the master's tool to dismantle the master's house. If we really are supposed to be this consciousness and conscious of the campus, our job is to push, and not just push students, right, to your point, but to push ourselves to think beyond sort of these normative, dominant narratives of what our work is supposed to be, which is, again, those narratives very much present across documents, for good or for bad, right? But I really do believe if our role is this consciousness, that we have to push. Because the individuals and groups that we're talking about as being missing, again, there's a connection to a systemic issue that has always been present that we don't deal with really well. Like we hint at it, but we don't go in for it. And so I think that's important.
And I think also there is a tendency to think of these outside of a particularized context. You have to understand the 1937 context. We have to look carefully at who was at the table as well as who was not at the table when this document was written. I think one of the more interesting stories is Esther Lloyd Jones's later apologies for the 1937 student personnel point of view. She felt it didn't focus enough on learning. That was, even the authors themselves at times in later years said, there are things really I would have done differently. And she said that about both the 37 and the 49 document writing in the 1950s, that she felt the documents focused too much on what we do and not enough on why we do it. She made that point in Student Personnel is Deeper Teaching. But again, thank you for the question. Others that have questions, or comments for that matter. We got two, so you can decide who goes first.
This question is probably more for George because he's older. I think one of the issues is that our institutions have changed in significant ways, particularly in the way leadership responds to issues, and variously described as a corporate style of governance. And one of the bigger differences, I think, and I would like you to respond in the sense of the conscience, there was a time when the conscience of the university was the president. You would see national figures asking intellectual leadership in the country for their opinions and how we should look at various issues and how we might want to think about things. That's no longer the case. And I read in a recent meeting, it was a meeting of college presidents, and 2/3 of them basically said they lack courage, which is kind of an interesting introspection. But where does our role relative to institutional leadership come into play, and was that thought about in these foundational documents? That's you, George.
You know, people who retire should stay retired, is what I think. Did you introduce yourself, Don?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, that's why. And sure, you just lob the grenade and then run for cover, which is kind of what's happening today. Any of our campuses at any moment can, explode is too strong a word here, but I think you get what I mean. We can become a front page story in the Chronicle or Inside Higher Ed, or we can leap all the way to the Wall Street Journal. And it can be a material disservice, or it can be a misunderstanding among well-intentioned people, or it can be exacerbated by the presence of folks who show up right after that occurs, who have nothing to do with the campus, but have every instinct to create a ruckus, and so we don't know, in essence. I mean, these are uncertain times, and your prelude into why you don't have many more college presidents speaking out is because they are now serving at the behest of their board, their governing board, whatever it is. And there are often strong signals from governing boards as to what we will do and what we won't do. I don't want to say it was any easier, in the 50s or in the 1910 to take a strong, bold statement. But if you made a statement, fewer people heard it. And you didn't have the constant 24/7 chatter on all sorts of outlets that would put their own spin on whatever it was you said. Now, if this sounds like I'm being an apologist, I'm just trying to be a realist. We know that our words can be twisted, and they can be segmented in a way to make us look ignorant or foolish or worse. There are a lot of circumstances, I think, that are driving administrators, senior administrators, to
the role of governing boards, and there have been hours of debate, and I know that our campus is not unique, but sort of dissecting the public letters that have been issued by university presidents, university provosts, but also professional organizations like NASPA and many, many others, AAU, and determining the strength and the language that's used. Are you condemning the immigration ban? Are you concerned? Are you supporting? Are you protecting? And it's raised this whole specter about the positions that universities should take. Individual faculty or faculty departments have taken very strong positions sort of under the mantle of academic freedom, but that is not something necessarily that student affairs practitioners may feel like they have. And so I think for many of us practitioners and faculty, this is definitely something that has weighed heavily on us.
I'll be very brief. I think part of the problem, I don't doubt that people think very hard about issues and that they recognize their statements can put them in a certain amount of jeopardy. I think the problem is that we don't make statements and think hard about issues until they are issues and they are a crisis. And that's where I would suggest the corporatization has a deeper impact. My name's Don Mills.
Good morning. My name is Ann Reber. I'm from Texas A&M University. And so my question is there a way to use these documents from 1937 on, which have informed our field, like Natasha said, and our professional history, to continue to show our university administrations the need for student affairs personnel, our divisions of student affairs, in light of what has happened most recently at North Dakota State University, this dismantling or dispersing of our divisions?
I don't know that most of us really know what happened at North Dakota State University, except a few bullets that we've seen, a few headlines. My understanding is that they don't have a person, several people lost their jobs, including the sitting VP for Student Affairs. I don't know the circumstances really, or the nature of interpersonal relationships between folks. There's typically more to a story than we read in the funny papers. They declared financial exigency or something close to it. There is a large number of people doing student affairs work still at the University of North Dakota. And the person who was an associate dean is really the senior student affairs officer now. The University of Kentucky, under the radar last year, did away with its division of student affairs in terms of a label, but if you go there, you will find just about everybody who was there before. Two people left because they retired and weren't senior people, they weren't replaced. But it was the provost's notion, this will sound odd to us, that the way we're going to move toward holistic undergraduate education here is to bring different parts of the university under the provost's office. You hear this a lot. This is not the first time this has happened. We go through waves of this for different reasons, one reason or another. Almost always we end up seeing a revision back to a structure that looks more familiar with a senior student affairs officer sitting on the president's cabinet. I think in both those instances and others, there's more going on here than we think, and it is not the case that these kinds of programs, services, activities are being devalued. It is, can we deliver them in a different way? Now, I stand to be corrected on this. It wouldn't surprise me if there's a new president at the University of North Dakota that establishes a VP for Student Affairs in 18 months or something like that. I'm not saying I've got any inside information here. I just think we want to be careful not to draw a conclusion that this work is being devalued. If you look around the country, institutions are not, by and large, divesting in these programs and services. The links between the key outcomes that state legislatures are looking for, persistence, graduation rates, you can trace back. When we went through a rendering about 20 years ago, it was pretty clear that the states that undercut, dissolved these kinds of programs and services saw the sharpest decreases in persistence and graduation. So now that doesn't say current policymakers remember the past. That's why we have historical documents.
Right.
One last comment. I think as you read about the North Dakota State story, the important thing for you to understand is that the president of North Dakota State was a former vice president for student affairs. So not someone who does not understand student affairs work. This was not a case of someone who came from business into higher education. It is a wrinkle to that particular story. I'm going to close with one question, and honestly, I think it's a yes-no question. So we can fit it in. In 1987, Judith Chambers, as NASPA president, wrote an introduction to a perspective on student affairs, where she says, the statement enumerates, and George touched on this, the major assumptions and beliefs which guide student affairs practice. We've seen several efforts since 1987 to frame our work and reframe it, including the Student Learning Imperative, Learning Reconsidered 1 and 2. We've talked today, both the panelists and the question have talked about things that are absent in all of those statements. But is there a value? Should we engage in an effort to once again articulate these shared assumptions and beliefs, or are these sorts of documents not really all that helpful as an undertaking?
I think we absolutely should, primarily because some time has passed. It is the penchant for people like me not to pay much attention to the past, and for material persuasive reasons, because things have changed. Every generation has to rediscover for itself why what it is they do is important and how best to do it. These kinds of documents can bring attention to that set of important tasks.
I vote yes, and I nominate us to be on that group. I'm kidding.
You already said it, and it's been.
I realized that after it was coming out of my mouth.
Yes, I definitely think that because there are changes, right? Our institutions, in many ways, have had shifts, while also acknowledging that there are also lots of things that haven't actually changed. We've just talked about them differently, and so I think an additional work would allow us to really unpack maybe more intentionally some of those things that really actually haven't changed but should, and to provide a vision, as some of these other documents have, for how to move forward in actually changing the things that haven't really changed.
I also vote yes. I like to think of these as living documents that are subject to scrutiny and new thought, but also recognizing, again, sort of the context in which they are created.
Well, great. Thank you all very much. Please join me in thanking our panelists. I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you very much for joining us this morning for this conversation.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, guys.
Somebody at home.